On our scale of how important people rated things for their choice of local provenance of plants, the sixth one was to relieve harvesting of wild plants. And there's two aspects to this. One, you can aim to grow local provenance plants so that you will then have your planted ones available as seed production areas, of which there are various variants. And the other is you might decide instead that if there's too much harvesting going on in the wild population locally, maybe you should bring in some seeds from outside. So there's those two approaches to the problem of relieving the pressure on wild populations to take their seeds and cuttings. Now, I don't think I've got anybody prepared in advance to speak to this issue, but does anyone on the panel want to make a comment about relieving the pressure from wild plants? And I think, Linda, you mentioned that this was a big issue. Have a microphone.
Maybe if you can just explain to me again.
Okay, we have the issue that a whole lot of plant species are now present in such small populations, and there is such demand for cuttings and seed material that we're in danger or have already taken too many seeds and cuttings to let them survive in the wild, and we're ending up with essentially horticultural specimens, and the wild ones are suffering as a result. So how do we deal with that?
Right, now I get it, sorry. So I'm a strong advocate for seed production areas for certain species, not for everything, but for certain species. And this is one of the big benefits, is to relieve the pressure on wild populations. And I have got some examples. I think that's for later in the day, is it? Am I doing?
Yes, we can do that this afternoon.
Yeah, okay. So I've got an example of some seed production areas we've been looking at with golden broken CMA. I think when I show you that example, I think you'll understand why you need to be careful about setting up your seed production area and what seed sources you use to bring into the seed production area. But I do think that they can be really useful because they're not only a seed production area, they become an insurance population as well. So it's a little bit like a captive breeding population, that if you've got a lot of small, highly impacted populations, you can actually bring them together and create a much more secure, larger and genetically diverse population. Does that help?
Yes. Darren, can you come up and talk about your role in this? Let me introduce to you Darren Wallace, who runs Operation Revegetation, which includes an Indigenous nursery out at Wanturna. And he has been growing Indigenous plants since the 80s. I think that's right. And he has made extensive use of planted plantings in order to avoid plundering the scarce resource of the wild seeds. So I'll get him to say something about this.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, I was just making a note then. I was thinking, yeah, I'm right into seed production areas, and they're called landscape jobs. A lot of my plants that we grow do end up in the field in landscape situations because we've provided the stock to start with. We've grown the plants. We're aware of the provenances and the origins. I'm unashamed about going back and rating their landscape jobs. It's something that works for me, and in many cases, certainly it takes the pressure off the bushland remnants. But it also gives me comfort that because bushland remnants are not necessarily genetically safe to collect from. We saw the correas there, but we heard a little bit about lomandras before, and I see huge diversity in Lomandra longifolia when I collect it from bushland areas with outcrossing with other lomandras, horticultural varieties. I'm really comfortable at collecting plants from large landscape jobs with quite a wide genetic base to start with, and nursery stock's obviously the other way of ensuring you're able to get seed and cutting material of the amount you want from your own stock, but it's all about knowing the origin of the plant to start with. Yeah.
Give some examples of species where they're rare and you've been able to provide them because you have them in plantings.
Yep. Well, maybe locally Lomandra multiflora out in Knox. There's very few plants in the wild. At some point in time, propagules had to be taken from those plants, but I wouldn't have collected a Lomandra multiflora from the wild for decades really. We've got so many plants in cultivation. They might be plants just in the garden beds. You know, even if you leave tube stock on off, they'll often flower. I don't think you really want them that big in pots, but yeah, larger pots certainly, and landscape jobs and factories and wherever else you might have used them, because they're an interesting plant. They are probably at risk of outcrossing with horticultural varieties, but that's something to watch for. Certainly cutting-grown plants, no problem having vast quantities of cutting-grown plants in your nursery and collecting cuttings from, or even just boxes of tube stock, Goodenia ovata. Not that anyone particularly would grow a lot of Goodenia from cuttings, I don't think. Maybe they do, but there's no problem taking Goodenia cuttings off boxes of cuttings and keep doing that. It's obviously ideal if the genetic base was seed-grown stuff to start with, though. So, yeah, big advocate of reducing the pressure on the bushland remnants by, in fact, collecting your plant material when you know where it was from to start with, from you know, landscape situations or your own garden for that matter. Yeah. Yeah, look, records are very important. I was fairly tardy in the past with record keeping on paper. It was all up here, and anyone in the room that bears that burden of trying to remember what they were doing 20 years ago, I sympathise, but I think I've got it sorted now. And yeah, when in doubt, don't collect. That's the approach that we've always taken, unless you are absolutely categoric about where stock emanated from, or in fact where where you believe it came from. Well, look, when in doubt, yeah, give it a miss. But yeah, record keeping pretty important these days.
Okay, now I'm thinking VoxVote might have something to say, but beforehand, can I just ask people to put up their hands if their Indigenous nurseries have adopted this approach of collecting from things they've planted in order to avoid plundering wild populations? Oh, lots and lots and lots. It's a very common thing. So what does VoxVote say? Couldn't. Microphone, please, Warren. Or no, Amanda's got one.
Did it? Yeah, there's 4 now. So we asked the question, how do you sustainably source your seed? And people have said that grasses are pretty easy to harvest because you can raise them as a crop. People are doing similar things about collecting them from their nursery in a range of sources, and partner projects and seed production areas.
Good. Grasses are easy to harvest as a crop, but hard to make money out of the process, as I understand it.